One of the things that's fascinating to look at as we study the cultures around the world is what happens to great works of art and architecture in times of war. Now, what we see is that often an invading army will pilfer and steal great works of art. Sometimes this is okay, like the gates at Babylon, the ancient gates of Babylon, were actually stolen by the Germans in the early part of the 20th century. Now, these were taken out of the country of Iraq, taken to a German museum, and so they exist intact to this day. Now, oftentimes great works of art are hidden away, and then they emerge after the conflict, and they're completely unscathed. Other times, works are destroyed. Hitler destroyed many paintings in World War II, and this great work that we're looking at now was blown up by the Taliban in 2001. This is the Bamiyan Buddha. There was two of them, and this particular version stands 165 feet tall. So think of a 16-story building. That's how big it is. Now, this was originally built in at least before the 5th century. That's when we have the first reports of it. And it was located near Kabul, Afghanistan, by a particularly treacherous part of the Silk Road. Now, the Silk Road ran for thousands of miles, and it linked China to the west. But this particular patch of the road was a rough one, as people went through the mountains and they had to face bandits and snow-covered peaks and all of that. So it's thought that the Buddhist travelers would either come through that rough patch and they would land here in this oasis and give thanks at the Buddha, or they would offer their prayers for safe passage before they went on that dangerous part of the journey. One of the things I love about this particular image is all the little monk cells that exist around it. You see, there's all these little places where monks would go and sit in retreat and work with the travelers. Now, the smaller of these two Buddhas, it had stairs, so the faithful could climb the stairs. It was 116 feet tall, and they would emerge on the right shoulder, on one shoulder, I'm not sure the right or the left, and they would circumambulate, so they would walk around in a clockwise direction around the neck, and then they would go downstairs on the other side. So these have been considered great masterpieces, but they were actually destroyed. They were blown up by the Taliban. And I've seen the films, and I could show you the films, but it's probably best if we just don't look at them and move on and consider these great works of art that we at least can remember in photographs. Next, we're going to travel far to the south to Sri Lanka, which is just off the tip of the Indian continent. We're looking here at the Palace of Sigiriya. It's up on this high plateau, and it was built by King Kassapa. And what he did was he kicked his father out of the rule. He usurped his father, and he drove his brother away, and he took control of the kingdom. And then he built this palace. Now, to enter the staircase, to climb all the way up to get to the palace, you had to go into the belly of a lion. And as you climbed up the staircase, you would pass these heavenly maidens that were painted along the way. Now, it didn't go all that well, really, for King Kassapa, because 11 years after he took control of the kingdom, his brother came back and drove him away, and this palace was given to the Buddhist monks. Looks like a pretty good place for a monastery. Let's take a look at these heavenly maidens, shall we? Here they are. They look like, not sure if that's fresco or another kind of a pigment, but these are the Sri Lankan version of a heavenly maiden, doing whatever it is that heavenly maidens do. But they would definitely guide your way as you walked up the stairs, the many, many stairs up to get to the palace. So let's pop back over to mainland India and talk about the Pallava period. One of the works of art to come out of the Pallava period it was when the Gupta people started to decline. It was another society that came into prominence. But what they had that was special is that they had a great sense of humor in their art. one of the great things that they did was more of these stone-cut temples. This is at a place called Tamil Nadu, and there's 5 of temples, much as we're looking at here. But in this place at Tamil Nadu, they also had something that's really unique and kind of special, and I want to take a look at it. First, look at this relief. Okay, there's a lot going on there, but right here below the elephant is something very special because it is a cat doing yoga. So even in the year 600, some artist had a little sense of humor and they hid that cat doing yoga in amongst all the other action that was happening in the relief. You gotta love that, because my feeling is, you gotta look for the humor wherever you can find it. The whole notion of the rock-cut temple really came to its apex around the year 1000 in Ellora. Here we have the Kailasha Temple at Ellora, and this is part of a complex of over 34 temples. Now remember, these are carved out of solid rock. Check this out. They had to go down about 107 feet to get to the bottom to build this 2-story temple. And if you look here at the little bitty people, you can get an idea of the size of it. One of the interesting things to note about the whole complex at Ellora is that these temples were built for the Buddhists, for the Jains, and for the Hindus. And this is a Hindu temple that we're looking at here. Okay, so we've looked at a lot of temples. And by now you might be glazing over a little bit and getting temple exhaustion. This might wake you up just a little bit when we look at the Kendariya Mahadeva Temple here. About the time that this was built, which would be around the year 1000, there were 2 major religious forces that were going through the Hindu tradition, and that would be the Bhakti tradition and the Tantric tradition. Now, the Bhakti tradition was more devotional, and the Tantric was more esoteric. And what that means is that the Bhaktis believed in just devotion to the divine. And in the Tantric tradition, they believed in an actual union with the divine forces. So part of how that was expressed was through this erotic art. And this temple has some of the most famous examples of that we know of. So it is an important part of our study of the art of India. So if you see right here, this is what is carved into that panel. And it's a lot of figures in doing all sorts of things, and not something that we see every day in sacred temples. So let's move on to Sri Lanka. By the 12th century, Buddhism had pretty much disappeared on the continent of India, but in Sri Lanka it was thriving. And what happened with that was that the Sri Lankans had a lot of trade with Southeast Asia. So they helped to spread the practice of Buddhism throughout Southeast Asia. And this is a typical depiction of the Buddha it's in a colossal form. In other words, it's real big. And here's a little bench so you can see how big it is. It's another rock cut form, so it's just carved out of the solid rock. But it's showing the Buddha at his death as he merges into nirvana, so to speak. Now we're going to leave the Indian subcontinent and move on to Southeast Asia. What we're looking at here is an early Buddha from Thailand. As Buddhism and Hinduism spread into Southeast Asia, the artwork reflected the sensibilities of the people and reflected the imagery that came with the religions. So here we have a Thai example of a Buddha, and it's a little different than the others. One thing that's distinctive about this one is the way that the mudras with both hands seem to be identical, and that's not something that we really see in many of the examples from the Indian continent. This guy's about 4 feet tall, and they think he might have been something that people would travel with. Another thing that's very distinctive about this one is that it's bronze, and that's something that we see a lot of in Thailand. And in fact, they traded their bronze that was found throughout Southeast Asia and beyond. Oh, look, it's another stupa, which means that that's all earthenworks. and it's a Buddhist shrine. But this one happens to be in Java. Now, this is a really fascinating story to this one, although it's just kind of an interesting structure overall, and it does reflect the Indonesian influence. All these things at the top are like little mini stupas, and you can circumambulate around it. But another thing that's really fascinating to me is that all around the sides are these carvings, and they're actually morality tales that change in subject as you climb towards the top. So right after this thing was built, it started to sort of spread out. As you can imagine, this huge pile of earth started to kind of, shall we say, erode. So what the builders did is they piled earth all around it. And in the process, they covered up some of the relief sculptures that were around the bottom. And here's one of the ones that they covered up that was unearthed in the 1800s. Here we go. This is great because it's telling you what'll happen if you get drunk. Over here, you get to be with the demons and all that business. But these are the people who are moderate, and apparently they get to have a heavenly existence. So here's the morality tale that's carved into the side of the stupa. So now we're going to go to Myanmar, or Burma. And this is a place that has been, really isolated from the rest of the world for a generation. Now this Ananda temple is a really great temple in a valley full of temples. It's a place I'd really love to visit because as you look, it's just full of all these temples. Now, if you look here also with a sort of an untrained eye, this can be the most magnificent one that we've seen all day. And that's because it's been completely restored. But it's probably not been restored in a traditional, authentic way. It's been restored by the government as they assumed it probably would have been. Here's a gold Buddha from that same temple. And this has had so many layers of gold leaf added to it that we've lost a lot of the features. But you can still get an idea of the grandeur of it. Going back to this, I just like to imagine what it would be like with all of these temples when they were in their original glory, when they were painted, when they had the shining shell and plaster coating to them. It must have been really impressive indeed. So the last temple that we're going to look at would be at Angkor Wat, which is located in Cambodia. And when we consider the history of Cambodia and its role in the Vietnam War, it's really a miracle that this has emerged unscathed. This is a little different picture than is in your textbook, but it gives an idea of the scope of the whole complex. Now this was built to honor a king that was named Jayavarman II. And in 802 he had a mystical experience when he climbed a mountain with a Brahmin priest. So in subsequent generations they honored him as a god king, and they built temples around the area to honor him. There was a guy that came along, another king, about 300 years later, named Suryavarman II. And instead of building his temple facing the east, like any good Hindu would, he made his facing the west. And instead of honoring Shiva, like any good Hindu in his lineage would, he dedicated himself to Vishnu. So this is a temple that was built by, in some ways, a sort of a rebel king, and it remains one of the architectural wonders of the world. The last image that we'll look at depicts a Hindu story called the churning of the ocean of milk. And it has to do with the elixir of immortality being raised to the surface by Vishnu when he takes the serpent and he wraps it around a mountain and he churns up the ocean to bring this elixir to humanity. So perhaps this is one of the secrets that lies behind the building of Angkor Wat. Whatever the real reason for this relief here, it's kind of a nice image to leave with. where all of this incredible art and architecture that's really from a different tradition, it has at its root perhaps basically benevolent wishes for humanity, and that this great elixir of life could come to the surface, be stirred up out of the ocean, and be useful to all people. Hey, this ends the lecture. Thanks for listening.